Most important thing, the beautiful thing is it's a technical solution to a political problem.
That is Emile Phaneuf talking about Bitcoin. My name is Timothy Virkkala, and this is the Local Focal Netcast.
I wrote this a two-part article series. The first part came out in August last year. I think the second part came out it's August 2020. The second part, I think, the next month or something. First and foremost, what it doesn't explore the who is it of Satoshi Nakamoto. I don't get into that. That's what everybody else has done forever since Bitcoin was launched in January 2009. There are different theories of who Satoshi Nakamoto was, whether a he or a she or a they. They in the sense that it could have actually been more than one person. I don't get into that. That's, like I said, there's enough of that all over the internet. What I was interested in doing was seeing what might have influenced whoever Satoshi Nakamoto was to have come up with it. So to do that, that's why I needed a two-part article series, because in the first part, what I did was I found privately issued digital currencies that existed before Bitcoin. There were a number of them, and some of them that I didn't even write about. And I've heard about others later on. World of Warcraft money apparently being used in the real world as a medium of exchange, for example. I didn't even write about that one. And then in the second part, I talked about the economic and philosophical origins of Bitcoin. We know that Satoshi Nakamoto, by his own writings, had both a philosophical leaning and economic influences. Right. So those are what I explore, both in his own writings, his or her. I'll say his because Satoshi Nakamoto, or Satoshi, that's a male name, so we'll just assume it's male for simplify things. So that's what I do.
And so where could we read this?
It's in a New Zealand digital asset exchange. Some of those digital assets being cryptocurrencies called Dasset. I write for them on their blog. So the website is dassetx.com, and it's on the blog. There's a link to the blog in the bottom of the main page. And it also appeared in Portuguese in Brazil on both parts by Objectivismo Brasil. So objectivism, you'll recognize that from Ayn Rand's philosophy, because as it turns out, Ayn Rand was actually a big influence for the inception of, say, Bitcoin.
Sort of a gulch of money. Is that what we're talking about here?
That's exactly, yeah. I'll get to that. So, okay, so these days, Bitcoin there's so much utility. So if fiat money is the government's money, like the dollars, yen, all this, yuan, if these are government money, Bitcoin, you could say, is the people's money, right? It's not inflationary. You don't need a bunch of creative theories justifying inflation to like it. That's what we get with government money. It's very deflationary, right? Its utility is so widespread that people who like it are both on the left and the right. So you can find articles saying that Bitcoin is the best thing for social justice that we've ever encountered as a human species, right? That's a left-wing argument, right? But I wanted to know who Satoshi's influences were, and as I discovered it would be what we would call mostly right-wing influences. So Ayn Rand, F.A. Hayek, David Friedman, son of Milton Friedman, people like this, and it has very strong Austrian roots. I know David Friedman, not from the Austrian school, obviously, but it has very strong Austrian roots. And just for example, the European Central Bank had a report, I think, in 2015, and they cited the very Austrian roots of Bitcoin.
So which ones in particular? Are we talking Menger's Origin of Money, Mises' Theory of Money and Credit, Hayek's Denationalized Money? What specifically? is Austrian about Bitcoin.
In the European Central Bank report, I don't remember mention of Menger or the origins of money. What I do remember from that report was the disliking of central banks, fractional reserve lending, bank bailouts, these kinds of things.
And Bitcoin is supposed to be immune to this kind of practice?
It has built-in functionality, built-in, let's say, features that are very, very, very robust and resistant towards being used in the same kind of way. Let me say, the beautiful thing about Bitcoin, like what we ask, what is Bitcoin? The best way to answer that is, okay, it's a medium of exchange, it's a store of value, these kinds of things. But the beautiful part of it is it's a protocol, right? It's like TCP/IP, or it's like, which is, what allows, which is what allows computers to talk to other computers over the internet, right? Or it's something like SMTP, which is outgoing mail, right? The beautiful thing about protocols is they just do what they're told. They just do what they're programmed to do, and that's all, right? So once you've programmed them to do that, and once there's a whole bunch of infrastructure around it doing just these basic things, it's very hard to change and say, we want it to change in a radical way to do something completely different, right? So for example, for TCP/IP, not only does TCP/IP allow computers to talk to other computers over the internet, but if you want to say, like, for example, as far as I understand, almost nobody on the internet uses IP version 6. They use IP version 4, which is 3 numbers, dot 3 numbers, dot 3 numbers, or sorry, up to 3 numbers, up to 255 3 more, between 1 and 3 more numbers, dot. So 4 times,
right.
3 dots, 4, right? So TCP/IP version 4 is like that. Now, there are different reasons why TCP/IP 6 is better. Apparently, it's encrypted, it's more secure, things like this. But because all the infrastructure is built around IP version 4, good luck getting everybody to switch. It's really tough to do. So Bitcoin is a protocol. It does have programmers. You can change it, but it's really hard to change it because people like what it does. People like that it has a limited supply, for example, right? And control on inflation. People like the what's called halving, which means every 4 years, what's called the issuance rate, which is the amount of new bitcoins that come into creation, is halved, right? It started with 50 bitcoins, then it was 25, then it was 12.5, and now it's 6.25. So if I'm not stating it incorrectly, every 10 minutes, 6.25 new bitcoins come into they enter the supply of total amount of bitcoins.
So the supply of Bitcoin increases at a decreasing rate.
That's correct. It's correct. They continue to increase, but they will continue to increase until it reaches exactly 21 million, and then there will not be any more bitcoins ever.
So any increased demand for Bitcoin would mean that it would be deflationary. Fixed supply, increased demand, deflation.
Well, okay. What can be for inflation, for price inflation? What is controlled by the protocol is the supply, but the protocol can't affect the demand. The demand is
right
what people value, whether higher or lower than before, kind of thing, right? But the protocol can affect the supply, and that's what it does do. Okay, so let me go back a little bit. The first thing I should address is maybe just mention a couple of the privately issued digital currencies that existed before Bitcoin that may or may not have influenced Satoshi Nakamoto, right? Bitcoin goes back to, its origins go back to what we call the cypherpunk movement, right? Which was in the 80s and the 90s. It was these, I'm sure there were some people of different, let's say, philosophical leanings than this, but for the ones that I've encountered, they seem to be on the crypto-anarchist libertarian worldview, you could say, right? Or at least something close to that. But there's one person in particular that should be mentioned first, and he wrote a paper in 1983 His name is David Chaum. As far as I understand, he's from the Netherlands, and he was worried about privacy, and he believed that a free people would have to be able to make economic transactions with their money in a way that couldn't be traced, neither by the store where they spend the money. Like if you walk into a store, you spend money, the store shouldn't know your name just because you bought something from them, right? And also from governments, right? And so he wrote a paper in 1983 arguing how what are called digital signatures could be used for untraceable payments. He thought that payments should be unlinked to other payments, that there shouldn't be a clear open ledger where there's time and date stamps all over everything, right? Because if you can get this information, you don't even need to know the person's name. After a while, with enough, we can call it metadata, we can find out who the person is, right? So David Chaum's model was not a decentralized model like Bitcoin was. His model was a centralized model, and he wanted to do it with working with the banking system. So he, long story short, 6 years later in 1989, a company, I don't remember if it started or if it stopped in 1989, but he was working with a company in Missouri somewhere, the state of Missouri in the U.S., and like with a real bank. For whatever reason, it didn't. I think why he says that it failed was it was a little bit ahead of its time. People weren't ready to make lots of purchases over the internet just yet, that kind of thing. But that's what happened, and that was called eCash. His company was called DigiCash, and the currency he created, again, a centralized model using a real bank, was called eCash. That's one, right? So he's what we call in the industry, he's an OG, original gangster, right? So he's old school. He was influential on the other cypherpunks. Later on, there were some others. There was one called Liberty Dollars and Liberty Euros, and I think that one was based in Nicaragua or somewhere in Central America. Long story short, I think that was the one that actually ended up. I don't want to confuse things, but that might have been the one that ended up getting shut down. I think used for was accused of being used for money laundering and so on. But that was another one where they had. I think they actually had real gold backing, real euros and real dollars, that kind of thing. So it actually had backing. That's that one. There were in early 2000s. I don't suspect that Satoshi Nakamoto learned about this one, but just to show a proof of concept, there were in 2001 there were researchers in the telecommunications industry working in I think it was Ghana, in Botswana, and I think it was Kenya, and they discovered that people were using mobile top-up, so like prepaid mobile credit, so for voice, for SMS or texting, and data. And they were sending these people, people were sending this credit back and forth to each other. Like they could send a text message to a code to open up credit for mobile services. And they realized that people were using this as a money to be able to go and work in one country and send money back home in another, kind of like remittances, or just send money to within the same country to a distant village where mom and dad and brothers and sisters are living, that kind of thing. So that's another privately issued digital currency before Bitcoin. And I've later learned that someone told me the other day that a guy, he used to work in Papua New Guinea, and he saw exactly the same thing happening there. Very interesting, right? So in the case of Africa, this concept of sending mobile data or mobile credit back and forth between people was later formalized and is now widespread and very popular, and it's called M-Pesa. And Pesa, if I'm not mistaken, is the Swahili word for money. And now M-Pesa works with, it's very formalized now. They work with the governments, and PayPal is now has integration with it. I think Alipay was the other one. So now they can really send data even further. So these things existed before Bitcoin. Another one was called QQ coin. That one's in China. So QQ is kind of like ICQ or AOL Instant Messenger or MSN Messenger, but they created a sort of a digital currency so that so that people could purchase games and so on, right? And later on, again, I forgot the exact year, but this was before the launch of Bitcoin, certainly. The Chinese central bank noticed it and said, "Oh, wait, what's happening here? There's value being sent back and forth, and it's not our currency. What's happening?" So, long story short, they didn't squash it because Tencent, the parent company, played ball, and they just formalized it. Right. So I don't know exactly what that means. I don't know what maybe there's limitations on what it can be spent on, and maybe there's some visibility on who's spending what amounts and when and that kind of thing. But QQ coin, privately issued digital currency before Bitcoin, was in existence. I don't know if Satoshi Nakamoto learned about it, but that happened. There's another one. PayPal. Peter Thiel still today, if you ask him what excites you, what technologies excite you, he always goes. I've been at a couple conferences and he was there, and he mentions Bitcoin. He's excited about Bitcoin. Interestingly, in the early days of Bitcoin, you could send Bitcoin to an IP address because the IP address was a full node on the network and often represented a specific wallet address. So it wasn't the case that it wasn't as frequently the case, at least, that one IP address would represent whatever, let's say, a wide range or 2 or 3 or 4 Bitcoin wallet addresses. So it was more you send Bitcoins to an IP address, but this is awfully similar to PayPal's concept. I think they launched this in the 90s, where you could, what Peter Thiel calls it, sending money to an email address, right? That was the idea. And of course, money isn't actually sent to an email address, but that's on the back end, right? Or rather, from the user experience, it seems like you're sending money to an email address. But of course, the email address is an account, which represents a bank account, which represents, a particular person who went through AML KYC, which is anti-money laundering, know your customer laws, and all this. But from the user experience, it seems like you merely send money to an email address. And that was something that is no longer in Bitcoin, but in the early days, there was something very similar where you could send Bitcoins to an IP address. There's a guy in this space. I always pronounce his last name incorrectly, so please forgive me. But it's called. His name is Nick Szabo, and he's an early. He's an OG as well, one of the cypherpunks. And what he came up with an idea called a mathematically trustworthy protocol, and that sounds awfully like what Satoshi Nakamoto put in his white paper, Bitcoin white paper, called cryptographic proof. It's a way of trusting mathematics rather than trusting fallible and corrupt institutions, right? Where we can trust open source software, which everyone can read and verify, and we can trust mathematics. So that was in 2009, I believe. No, I'm sorry. That was all the way back to 1999. 2009 was 10 years later. That was when Bitcoin was launched. Also, there's the he mentions a spreadsheet that runs across the internet. So think about that, a spreadsheet that runs across the internet. Anybody that's dug into Bitcoin a little bit and the underlying blockchain technology, what is a blockchain? It's a distributed ledger where everybody can check and verify the transactions. And there's some disagreement that can be, there's checks and balances in place where that can be dealt with, right? But a distributed ledger, what we now call a distributed ledger or a blockchain, goes back to what Nick Szabo called a spreadsheet that runs across the internet. So that's.
And what year was that?
1999.
So the inventor of Bitcoin inherited a lot of knowledge and ideas, and he improved on his predecessors. What is the great improvement of Bitcoin?
I encourage everybody to read his white paper. It's 8 pages, and what he did was he solved a particular problem, and that was the problem of the double spend problem. So he's able to make sure that the same coin can't be spent twice, but he's able to achieve this without relying on a trusted third party. That's the key. That's the problem that he solved. So he indeed stood on the shoulders of giants, but he did. So it was sort of the next step that needed to be solved after a lot of people before him had built had sort of led whoever. If it wasn't him, someone else might have done it 10 years later or 5 or whatever. But it was the next thing.
And then he also added the protocols for the increase in the supply of Bitcoin, right?
Yes. If you read the white paper, I think it's right. It might be right in the abstract on the first page. He says that what he hopes to achieve is a currency that mirrors the rate at which gold is entered into the economy. So again, that's what he does with the halving of the numbers of Bitcoins that enter the supply every 10 minutes. That it's also with the 21 million cap. There will only be 21 million Bitcoins ever. Yeah, he explicitly says that he's trying to copy what gold does.
So here we are in a world of many billions of people, and we're going to wind up with 21 million Bitcoin. So obviously, to make it work, that has to be tradable in very small increments, micro increments of Bitcoin, right?
So yeah, one of the properties of money is divisibility. So is the question that often gets asked by people that sort of just enter this space is they ask it, well, is Bitcoin divisible? As it just so happens, a Bitcoin can be divided. So the smallest increment of a Bitcoin is 0.111111. I'm sorry. I should have said zeros. 0.0000001. So the smallest increment of a Bitcoin is called a Satoshi. So eight decimal places to the right.
That seems awfully small.
Oh yeah, that's awfully small. And if you think if you think of Bitcoins as $1, it's like $21 million. That's it. That we all have to split. But no. Remember, one Bitcoin as of today is worth something like 56,000 US dollars, and you can divide this up into 8 places to the right of the decimal. So there's plenty of Bitcoin to go around. You don't have to buy a whole one anymore. It used to be the case that people would buy thousands, and they would buy T-shirts for thousands of Bitcoins in the beginning, right, before it had much of a market value. But now that's not the case. Nobody's going to throw around even one Bitcoin at anything. They're not going to buy a pen for one Bitcoin. They're not even going to buy a car for one Bitcoin. Most of them, and soon people won't even be buying houses for one Bitcoin.
So at some point, the word Satoshi will be used as a term for wealth.
That's correct. Some people in the community talk about in terms of when they send Bitcoins back and forth to each other, they don't even talk in terms of how many fractions of one Bitcoin. That's complicated to do. What they do is they talk about how many Satoshis or how many, I think it's called millibits, something like that.
So that makes perfect sense. I have to confess that I've been resistant so far to the Bitcoin allure, but maybe by the end of this talk I'll have bitten the lure. Anyway, you don't stop with discussion of predecessors to Bitcoin or the basic idea of Bitcoin. You also go into the predecessors intellectually, that is, the theoretics behind money.
Yep. So that's the next natural place to go. So that was the second part of my 2-part article series, and this part is economic and philosophical origins. So it's important to begin with, well, what did Satoshi himself say? Did he say anything that would give away his leanings, his economic and philosophical influences? As it turns out, 2 months before Bitcoin's launch, he published on a mailing list that he had a soon to be released cryptocurrency that would be very attractive to the libertarian viewpoint. So He says it, that's in his own words. Very attractive to the libertarian viewpoint. And in January 2009, when Bitcoin was officially launched, the first block that was mined, you can ignore what that means, blocks being mined, for the purpose of this particular. But basically, when you mine a block, you mine Bitcoin, right? You can actually put a message in a block, and he did. And in that block, in January 2009, he cites the Times article, newspaper based in the UK, which references a 3 January 2009 article which has the title "Chancellor on Brink of Second Bailout for Banks." So he, in other words, he was mentioning it was a bit of activism on his part, put it that way. He clearly didn't like that banks were going to be bailed out by taxpayer money. And it wasn't only the case that the banks were being bailed out, because remember that this was during the time of also the American automobile industry bailout, right? So we certainly know from Satoshi Nakamoto that he dislikes bank bailouts, but we might also be able to imply from this that rather infer that he has a disliking of central banking in general, possibly. Also that he might dislike fiat or government-issued currency. Also, he might also dislike fractional reserve lending. Right, these things tend to go together when you sort of research the. As you know, I know you know this, but I'm sort of speaking for the audience. But as you find a disliking for bank bailouts from the economic side, you also find that a lot of the same economists they dislike central banking generally. They don't like fiat currency often, and often also not fractional reserve lending.
To me, Bitcoin looks like the ultimate and best form of outside money. Are you familiar with the distinction between inside and outside money in the banking system?
Actually, no.
It's not universally used, but some economists apply the terms to explain what's going on in the banking system. Inside money is the money that banks use on their ledgers. It's the money they create when they lend money. The demand deposits become loans, all that sort of stuff, fractional reserve. It's their money. It's the banking system's money, and it doesn't need to be anything other than ones and zeros and pencil markings in ledgers. That's all it needs to be. Outside money is what the banking system doesn't control. So it could just be printed money by the governments involved. That's their currency. In olden days, it was gold or silver or copper or tobacco or whatever. Bitcoin is often billed as outsider money, and it suggests to me that the outsider nature of it would fit outside money really well. Banks could play off it all they want, but they wouldn't be able to control it, though they would have a great effect on the economy if they actually used it and built normal banking services off of it. And we know that not only banks, but many big companies are buying Bitcoin quite studiously.
Oh, yeah. Insurance companies, car companies. Tesla bought 1.5 billion worth. And PayPal integrated Bitcoin recently onto its platform.
Okay.
A MasterCard just launched, I think it's credit cards where you hold cryptocurrencies, certainly Bitcoin, I think Ethereum too, maybe one or two others. You hold your cryptocurrencies with some outside company, and then what MasterCard does is issues a credit card or debit maybe, where you can go and spend in real world dollars. What happens is that your Bitcoin, your cryptocurrency is sold live there on the spot, but the retailer or the merchant actually receives real world dollars.
I use the Cash App, and the Cash App does that. I can buy Bitcoin on the Cash App. That's $cash or cash.app. My moniker is $Workman. That's Workman with an I, and I don't know. You can send me money, folks. Send me Bitcoin. Anyway, what was my point? My point is that Bitcoin as an outside money doesn't mean that inside money doesn't exist anymore. With currency, one doesn't need to be part of a banking system, and Bitcoin does many of the things banks do, trade with people in distant lands, but banks could still exist, and they do exist, and they are beginning to use Bitcoin, right?
Certainly, companies will put Bitcoin on their balance sheets. Whether they go and issue real world dollars based on those holdings of crypto, I don't know if that's done yet. Maybe it is. Maybe it is.
Now, there seem to be a number of services and Bitcoin accessories that people use to make Bitcoin trades easier. What is going on here?
I know that a lot of people they'll add, to be redundant, they will add add-ons. I don't know if that's so there's custodial and non-custodial. So some of these they're custodial, which means that your bitcoins are actually held with a company like, let's say, Robinhood, for example, or one of these. Um, Not non-custodial, meaning they don't hold it. Bitcoin is developed enough to where you don't have to actually trust somebody else with your bitcoins. Put it that way.
We've strayed a bit from the mainstream of what we're talking about here, but the real world elements of buying and selling Bitcoin are very intriguing. And it's certainly relevant now that lots of rich people are buying Bitcoin.
And poor people. This is an important point. It's the people's money. Bitcoin's big in Venezuela. People living under high inflation.
Okay, they're buying many Satoshi.
Yeah, you could say that. But also, I read an article from FEE.org for the listeners recently that it was a Panamanian cryptocurrency partnered with a Venezuelan payment service. So people living in Venezuela are able to actually go and with merchants. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if they actually spend bitcoins with the merchants or if the bitcoins owned by a Venezuelan citizen are exchanged in real time for dollars, and the merchants receive dollars. But there's a new launch by, I think, Megasoft is the company in Venezuela. Megasoft, the payment processor. But so yeah, it's again bitcoins for those among us who have little as well.
And that all comes down to the great divisibility in Bitcoin, because the dollar is limited after all. It goes down only to 0.01.
That's right, a cent. Yeah, penny.
Now, from the beginning, I've been worrying that Bitcoin would get cracked down by the government. I mean, governments like to crack down on competition. We know that from Lysander Spooner's American Stamp Company, and we know it from everyday experience. But I've been told by people who seem to know what they're talking about that that's unlikely because the rich are buying and investing in Bitcoin, and they are not going to tolerate being stolen from by the government any more than they are already.
If they were going to squash it, they would have been better off squashing it in the beginning. They didn't. Now it's big, and yes, certainly the big players, the big banks, and hedge funds, insurance companies. These people haven't just bought; they haven't only invested in companies in the Bitcoin and blockchain space. They've actually invested in Bitcoins themselves. So, and these are the people that have the ears of politicians. So this is good for everybody. In fact, this is good for everybody because you can't imagine Goldman Sachs going and lobbying the U.S. government to make bitcoins illegal. Certainly not anymore. If they hold bitcoins on their balance sheets, right? So governments so Bitcoin has varying degrees of legality and illegality around the world. In the case of the U.S., it's not, nobody tries to squash Bitcoin. Nobody tries to make all Bitcoin holdings illegal because they realize it's not really feasible, and they don't want to create a bunch of, for people that are perfectly happy to pay taxes on their bitcoins. Why would they go and squash that and put those people in jail? They want people to pay taxes, so it's a source of revenue for the IRS. So why squash it? They know it can't be squashed, so why try to squash it when squashing it would usually mean that you lose out on tax revenue.
But if it's truly a private coinage, it would seem to be that it would be hard for the IRS to figure out who owns what.
Yes, it's more difficult, certainly. But the IRS, for example, is investing heavily in blockchain analytical services. For example, from one company called Chainalysis. So I used to have a link that I saved somewhere. I could probably find it, but there's a U.S. government vendor website that has, just for matters of transparency, they have a list of all the vendors for the U.S. government. Presumably some aren't there, maybe for national security reasons, but by and large, many, if not most, companies that are vendors to the U.S. government are listed, as well as the values of their contracts in dollars. And last I checked, Chainalysis, sometime last year, they had won contracts from the IRS for in the millions of dollars to break down which addresses are known to belong to which either aliases or real world identities, and where they were spent, whether some coins had been spent on the dark net in the past, this kind of thing. And they sort of break down a risk analysis. So if some bitcoins were known to have been spent to an address on the dark net, the dark net sells all sorts of illegal stuff. So if this is a private company, contracted to the IRS and says, here's some known addresses that are, involved in some shady activities, and in some cases, and here's the real world identity of the people using these addresses, that kind of thing. So certainly the U.S. government is investing heavily in knowing who owns what.
Well, that certainly adds a wrinkle to the liberatory hopes that some of us had for cryptocurrency. It looks that cash remains the thing that governments really hate, the things that we carry around in our pockets, physical things that can be used as money, are really what piss the government off, because they're harder to track. I don't see goodness coming out of a move away from cash. I'm old-fashioned, I guess. I prefer physical things in my pocket, at least some of the time.
I know certainly in the case of New Zealand, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, the New Zealand Central Bank, there's a PDF from their own website that I have, is their plans or their hopes to phase out cash. It's a little difficult because certainly credit cards they often charge, they have international transaction fees, and if you're a country that depends on tourism, like New Zealand does, you can't really make it the case to where nobody wants to come to your country, because the credit cards or debit cards that are issued in their home countries, when they come to New Zealand, they're going to be charged 2.5% on everything they buy, right? So you have to have cash available. That's one of the reasons why you need cash. Also, laundry mats, stuff like this, car washes, people just want to put some coins in. And parents want to be able to give allowances to their kids. I want to be able to give allowances to my kids.
But speaking of old-fashioned, that brings us back to the old Mengerian theory about the origin of money, which arises from barter. Bitcoin didn't seem to arise out of barter. It doesn't seem to tell the Mengerian story. Oh, and for the listeners, we're talking about Karl Menger here, the Austrian initiator of the marginalist revolution.
Well, yeah. Here's the thing. I sort of struggle to answer the question for myself, and I've started to write a half of an article on this, and I thought I need to do some more thinking about it before I put anything concrete out on for the world to read. Is whether Bitcoin is an intelligent design or whether it's a spontaneous order. Right? It was certainly intelligently designed, but here's the thing. Like I said earlier, Satoshi Nakamoto stood on the shoulders of giants, right? And there were incremental improvements to the direction where it was going. So that's the idea of spontaneous order, is that situational, someone on the spot, what Hayek calls the man on the spot, is looking for a solution to a problem and then comes up with it spontaneously, right? And over time, something develops. This is how languages work. The best example of this that I've found is Nicaraguan Sign Language, where a bunch of kids who were all deaf, all of them, and hadn't been taught any sign language for adults. They had been kept in the same schoolhouse or something and living together, and they came up with a whole language all by themselves. It's called Nicaraguan Sign Language. Nobody taught it to them. It's just a bunch of kids made a whole language, right? I wouldn't say that Bitcoin is quite as beautiful of a spontaneous order as that one, right? But it certainly evolved over time through lots of little incremental improvements and a bunch of crypto anarchists feeding off each other for ideas and reading economic and philosophical theory and this kind of stuff.
Well, I don't consider Bitcoin spontaneous at all. To me, it's a designed order. It's an instrument. And there's a long conversation we could have about this, but let's probably skip that for now. I have lots of heretical or perhaps quite orthodox thoughts on the difference between spontaneous and planned orders in the institutional and organizational frameworks that we live. But that's beside the point. Do you consider Bitcoin money?
Everything comes down to definitions. It's certainly a currency. Some of the gold bug economists like Peter Thiel will say, no, it's not a money because they say that gold apparently has what he calls intrinsic value, which is a value in itself. But then if you want to be a true Austrian, you should say, well, all value is subjective. So how can something have value in itself? That's a little silly. Uh, Certainly, it's a medium of exchange.
Is that certain? Because, I mean, how much is exchanged, traded normally, and how much is invested, just bought and held?
Store of value versus medium of exchange. I would say most people getting into it, they see they see the design in it, they see all the big investors into it, and the investors see the other investors and see utility over time. That if you read the Mises theory of money and credit, he says that a money holds value. I might be stating it slightly wrong, but ultimately the ultimate value of a money is its use as a medium of exchange. Comes down to that, not store of value, but medium of exchange. Is something over time, is it going to continue holding value if other people won't accept it as medium of exchange? Right? That's a very important point. And that's the source of one of the big debates in the community. That this is why you have a competing coin called Bitcoin Cash, because Roger Ver, an Austrian, he didn't. Long story. I'll skip the technical details, but he didn't think that Bitcoin he didn't think that Bitcoin Core, the programmers of Bitcoin who continue to program, make updates to the Bitcoin protocol and so on. He didn't think that they understood that Bitcoin BTC that it ultimately needed to be used as a medium of exchange rather than a store of value. So he created one that would have lower transaction fees in his own way. He increased the so-called block size, but I'll let the listeners Google that.
I have friends who've argued about this at length, and I'm kind of agnostic on the whole issue. But to me, everything seems to come down with how easy is it to make exchanges with Bitcoin.
Well, yeah, there are whole websites that will, for example, you can buy Amazon credit. So if you can buy Amazon credit or Amazon gift card, put it that way, you can buy anything that is sold on Amazon as long as the seller will have it delivered to you.
But that all seems circuitous because right now we aren't really buying things with Bitcoin. We're buying dollars with Bitcoin and then buying things with dollars.
It doesn't yet have widespread. It does have widespread adoption. It's just that it doesn't have widespread adoption everywhere. So if you want to go to a brick and mortar coffee shop or whatever, you're in a big city, you'll find 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 15, depending on where you live. But if you're willing to purchase things off the internet or often merchants will accept Bitcoin, but they're not actually accepting Bitcoin. They're working with a company like BitPay, and BitPay just allows consumers to spend their Bitcoin with BitPay, and in real time, BitPay exchanges those for dollars. And if the retailer doesn't actually want Bitcoin, then the retailer accepts real world dollars rather than Bitcoin.
So to get back to the theoretical, what are the other theoretical influences on Satoshi Nakamoto?
With the crypto anarchist libertarian cypherpunks, the cypherpunk movement, they had a mailing list, at least in the early 90s, if not also in the early 80s. And the man that ran it was his name is Timothy May. Timothy May. We know who influenced the cypherpunk movement because the main guy running the mailing list explicitly said who the philosophers and economists that were influencing the movement were. So he mentioned David Friedman by name, Ayn Rand by name, F.A. Hayek by name. I know because I've got a link to it in the article. You got a list, the whole text for every email he ever sent out in the mailing list is in one long text document. You just Control F and type Friedman, Control F type Rand, and there they are. right? But May very interestingly said that he was looking to create a gulch in cyberspace, right? So for the listeners that might not be familiar with what that means, what the hell's a gulch? So Galt's Gulch, I know you know this very well. Galt's Gulch was a place that existed in Ayn Rand's novel called Atlas Shrugged that she published back, I think, in the 50s. And Galt's Gulch was a place, was sort of a what might be called a libertarian utopian society where property rights were protected and where some of the more let's say capable humans, competent human beings that might have been well-to-do and where they wanted to surround themselves with people like them that respected property rights and the exchange of ideas. And so where was it in the book? Was it hidden in Colorado someplace? Is that what it was?
In Ouray.
But yeah, that's Galt's Gulch. It's a place that exists in real space, but only in a fiction book, right? So Timothy May said what they were going for was a Galt's Gulch in cyberspace. So if you if you realize that most of what happened, at least over time, certainly these days, with CCTVs everywhere, facial recognition, AI reading your faces and tracking the uh, all of our bank transactions, our cars as they drive around urban areas, the license plates, just automated. There's mass data of what happens in real space. So what they were trying to do was create again a Galt's Gulch in cyberspace where we could we humans could sort of, let's say, hide away and have some element of freedom away from the corrupt institutions of the real world, right? And the way in which they sought to create, let's say, what might be called a libertarian utopia over the internet was through cryptography, right? They wanted to create institutions, including money, that 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 relied on cryptography. Uh, so let's say through open source software and which is verifiable by anybody that knows how to read it and by mathematics.
So, in addition to Ayn Rand, there are others. Hayek comes to mind, Friedrich August von Hayek. I remember one major essay, well, two actually. The one I'm thinking of is The Denationalization of Money by Hayek, but he also wrote A Choice in Currencies. And is that covered in your essay?
So Hayek's name is mentioned. I don't remember if in the mailing list if Timothy May mentioned Hayek's book or not. But yes, as you mentioned, Hayek has a book called The Denationalization of Money. And Hayek argued in that book that that the state's blessing being necessary for money to hold value was something closer to superstition, and that um, in that in requiring people to use a particular currency, the state money, the fiat currency, and requiring anybody to use one particular currency only added an element of uncertainty that otherwise wouldn't be there. So, if, for example, we both suspect that the price of Bitcoin will go up over time, but you're willing to fork over some Bitcoins, and I'm certainly counting for it to go up over time, and I would prefer to be paid in Bitcoin. If the government says that no, I can only accept U.S. dollars from you, well, then that adds an element of uncertainty. I'm like, okay, well, I suspect the government's going to inflate the dollar. You know what I mean? So there's uncertainty when you can't have a competition of currencies.
Hayek's mentor, Ludwig von Mises, also was famous for his monetary theory, and that figures in, right?
Ludwig von Mises, for example, was a big gold bug, if you want to call it that.
But how does Goldbug fit in with Bitcoin?
Satoshi Nakamoto mentions right on the website, as I said earlier, that he specifically created the algorithm of the issuance of new Bitcoins to mirror the rate at which he would hope to mirror the rate at which gold comes into circulation from mining new gold. There's that. Of course, gold is something tangible, right? It's something that has industrial use, it has aesthetic use in jewelry. Bitcoin doesn't have metallic properties, right? It exists. It indeed has value. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the price of it being 56,000 US dollars for one of them right now. But I think going back to Mises' theory of money and credit is that money holds value certainly for the long term if people believe that other people will accept it as a medium of exchange, right? And so there's that. We can find other examples of this in other privately issued digital currencies. QQ coin has value. People, it's not backed by anything. It's just a digital currency. People accept it. They'll let you play their games if you spend QQ coin. There's World of Warcraft money that apparently gets used and sold in the real world. Avatars, people, you can't physically. Avatars aren't touched. They're not tangible. You can't physically touch them. They only exist on the internet. But people will spend real world dollars for avatars, and even real world dollars these days in the post Bretton Woods world. Our dollars are only based on the faith that the U.S. dollar, or the U.S. government, or the dollars have on them legal tender. But they only exist because government says this is what you use for money, and they're not backed by gold. So so for people that have objections to Bitcoin, you often have to say, all right, first, is that an objection that also applies to fiat currency? And often you'll find that actually that's an objection to fiat currency as well. So it doesn't often hold.
I can think of one reason to offer the gold bugs to invest in Bitcoin and prefer it, I guess. That would be asteroid mining. There's a lot of investment into space these days by many of the major countries and many major companies behind the scenes, and they really want to take asteroids and mine them. And there could be a lot of gold up there. There certainly is a lot of other metals. But if there's gold, that's going to have an effect on a gold-backed monetary system.
Yeah. I find that quite exciting. Of course, it means for everybody's holdings, the real world, the real world market value of gold goes down because suddenly you've got a new influx. But yeah, I've also read exactly that. But of course, there's a lot of costs in getting it from an asteroid to Earth, and we might find that it's not as bad as we thought. I don't know. We'll see.
So do you have any final thoughts, or can there be any real final thoughts when it comes to Bitcoin at this point in time?
I think we certainly covered it. Just again, I tried to fit a gap. Most people, they explore who Satoshi Nakamoto was. What I did was I went out and find actual things that he wrote would be interesting for the libertarian point of view. He mined into the Genesis block in January 2009. Bitcoin, something about bailing out banks, which certainly seems like to be a motivation. He also mentioned in another blog post some months after Bitcoin launched something about the endless credit, influx of credit and the booms and bust cycles that, in his view, come about as a result of that influx of cheap credit.
And now that we have the inside money of the bankers going absolutely crazy under the necessities of politicians, the state, the military-industrial complex, the endless bailouts, subsidies, and stimulus packages because of COVID, boy, it looks like things are going to get very, very interesting very, very quickly here.
There's endless learning about it. I'm still learning. There's certain things that are somewhat technical that I get into, that I try to get into, and then I'll explain it to someone else, and someone that knows more than me will be sitting next to me and they'll say, that's not quite right. And I'll think, how did I not get that right? I read a lot about it. And then they'll point out so there's a lot to learn. The most important thing, the beautiful thing is it's a technical solution to a political problem. The political problem being fiat money generally, and you know what they are, but it's a technical solution to that.
Well, thanks, Emile. That was great. And thanks to the listeners and viewers of the Locofoco Netcast. I had recorded this a month earlier, at least, before publishing because of technical difficulties. I hope that they weren't too much in this final product. And I'd like to mention that Emile has written more for dacidx.com. His most recent thing that I've read is, Does Gold Have Intrinsic Value? Obviously relevant to this conversation.